Hey everyone, so I'm going to begin with some of the demos. We're going to start with color matching on this one. So I'm kind of looking, I'm examining the levels of color in each thing, and then we're going to try to swatch right onto our printout so that when we can see it dry, we know what color it's really going to be. So I'm beginning with the sleeve here. I've got a bit of kind of my warmer yellow, my heavier one, not a lemon yellow. Touch of white into it to mute it down, remembering that whenever we mix white, that titanium white acrylic into our colors, it does cool them just a little bit on top of making them a little whiter. It adds a little coolness. I'm adding a bit of this ochre color. I know we all have different names on all of our paints now, so sorry I can't be as specific, but I've got this kind of warm ochre I'm using, and I'm going to use a little touch of blue-gray, which will kind of green out the yellow a bit too. Those two colors mixed together make a pretty good gray, kind of greenish tone for that deep shadow down at the bottom of the sleeve and in the corner of the elbow. This is my Payne's gray. It's sort of like if you took a deep navy and mixed in a little bit of black. I use that on a lot of things, especially if I want to neutralize them. In this case, the blue is mixing with the orange and creating a nice neutral that has still some warmth to it, some greenish tones. Proving that that white shirt is not white, we're going to begin with white and mix in a bit of that blue-gray and then just a touch of our kind of muddy tone that we created for the shadows in the yellow sleeve to help create a warm gray. When you are working on this painting, realizing that there's actually quite a few levels of color in each thing. There's about 4 in the shirt, so you could create gradients of it. Some of them are warmer, some of them are cooler, and there are 4-ish in the yellow sleeves. Also, as you're working, you're going to start to notice a lot of your colors can be used to tint and mix with other colors. So once you've built that kind of like muddy brownish tone, it works great to help you build the shadows in a couple different areas to do that top layer of wallpaper, and to add depth to multiple colors and kind of subdue them. So we're mixing for this top wallpaper color. I'm going to end up using a dash of the warmest yellow, quite a bit of ochre, and then that navy with a touch of black in it in order to create a nice muddy, it's kind of a sickly brown really. And then we're making one with a little bit more yellow in it and just a touch more white in it, itty bitty, to create the paler version of it. To make the salmon, we're working with a bit of orange. For a starter, this orange has a low opacity, which will make it slightly annoying to work with. We're going to add in just a little bit of white to start, and then see kind of as we're going, we can always keep adding more. A little bit of yellow, a touch of red, and a small itty bitty touch of this purple. Close, but I wanted to go just a little bit pinker, so I'm like little tiny feather dot of red into it will help us get there. Then you can see that that's very bright. If we mix in the white, we can get very, very close. So I'm going ahead and adding a couple dots of my glazing medium to things. It does increase their sheerness, which can make them kind of annoying to work with if you've added it to everything. I like to keep it on like one side of the color I've mixed, so I have essentially an opaque version of that color and a sheer version. And you also should swatch them, like test your colors before you add the glazing medium, because once it's mixed in the pan, since it's kind of whitish, milky-ish until it dries, it can affect what the color looks like when it's wet. So when you're swatching your colors, it's a little easier to see it before you add the medium. I'm working on the teal of that back wall now. I'm using a green, an ultramarine, and a touch of black in it to kind of pull it down. Yes, I am totally mixing just with my paintbrush because it's speedy and we're just doing tiny amounts for the size of demos. And yes, I did tell you not to do that, but doing it anyway. The reason I kind of can dab out, or the reason I might dab out some of the swatches as I put them on the papers to see what they look like sheared out and see how close the mix is when it's sheer versus when it's fully opaque. First thing we're going to work on is the wallpaper. I want to build up a nice flat area of the lighter color of the wall, that top portion of it. So there's kind of that darker and then a slightly lighter version of the vertical stripes. I'm going to paint the whole thing with the lighter version. I'm going to have to mix a little bit more quantity of paint, especially to cover the white of the paper that we're seeing showing through. So that's that ochre. It's quite a bit of the navy. I'm skipping the white entirely. I have a tiny amount of medium in there, but really not any at all. I want this to be fairly opaque seeming. Now I'm adding in some of that yellow, and now I'm adding in just a little bit of white. Your white is your most opaque paint, actually, partially because if you ever put white on top of something, you would like it to cover it. And it's great for using as a base layer on things, which we'll show in a little bit, but it can really help you build it up. So see how you can still kind of see the paper through this? My brush strokes are showing a lot. That's partially from the sheerness of the paint. We always are like, it's so opaque. Acrylic is so opaque sometimes. So adding a little white to it, you can quickly see that it helps it really feel much flatter and helps it build up. I'm using a wide brush so that I have fewer brush strokes and painting from side to side. If you want something very, very flat, I recommend 2 layers of paint in order to avoid any brush strokes overall. So once that dries, I went ahead and laid some masking tape down to sort of start our different stripes and areas and to get clean edges. You can still use masking tape as masking. We're going to make the darker on the sides with skip the white, skip the brighter yellow, and just using that ochre and Payne's gray, which is navy and black. It takes a couple layers, as you can see, to build it up and get it smooth, because it does have a little bit of sheerness to it. Without the white in it, it's not as thick. While those dry, we're going to go ahead and mix the base color of the teal for the bottom layer. Once this is all dry, we'll pull out that tape, and that would be our salmon stripe. I can go ahead and peel this top layer as long as I'm very careful while the brown is still a little wet, and add in the smaller vertical stripes, doing everything at like top speed here just so you can see kind of the basic ideas of stuff. There's a little tiny black edge stripe on the bottom side of that salmon horizontal line. While that's all drying, we're going to start laying in they're kind of like overlapping oval patterns on the teal wallpaper. So we have to mix sort of one color, sort of 2 colors. So where they overlap, they become more opaque. 2 schools of thought. You can literally try to paint them as 2 shears and hope they overlap and add up, or you can do what I'm about to do, which is paint the middle area first, knowing that the white in it is opaque. Mixing white into your paint will help it create opaqueness. It also makes it seem brighter. And then we'll go through, once that dries, and paint the larger parts of the oval with this without the white in it, or at least with much less white in it, and adding gel medium. So there's the gel medium. You can see because I have a small brush, I'm getting quite a bit of texture inside these spheres. So I'm going to switch for a larger one. It's a solid example of using the biggest brush you can to help create smoothness. I realized that was a little bit hot, so we're making a slightly greener version of it to blend into the back wall a bit better. Keeping medium in it so it's sheer, so we're seeing what's showing through the base layers coming through. We are going to try to mix the color for the little dots, the little ovals up on the brown section of the wall. We're going to use the same technique. Paint the middle sections first, or paint them. I'm just switching around my technique. Apparently I've forgotten what I did. My bad. So I'm painting these as a whole shape, and then I'll go in and add brightness to the center, partially because they're so small, and because I did not sketch them first. We're just making it up now. I'm gonna let that dry, those base layers dry, and start work on this area. I realized that I should have laid the tape down before I did that first pass, so I'm using white and letting it dry in that area. So while that's drying, because we don't, especially the white can take a little bit of time to dry. It can be kind of tacky. We're going to hop over and look at how we would approach some of these like drapery sections. So what we are going to do is use kind of wet blending. I went ahead and put down a base layer of the yellow, which is like the medium tone, and then we're going to, while it's still wet, use our brush to start blocking in the mids, which have a little bit of green to them, a little deader color, more dead color. And then we can go ahead while those are still wet and start creating balance by adding in more definition of lighter areas. I used a little bit of a large brush for that section, so I want to widen up my initial layer and create more contrast from the shadows. It's kind of an angular approach on this painting. So now while it's still all drying, I am going in and adding the shadows. I am working with very thin layers, which is helping it be like tacky, but not so like not wet and not dry. If you want to work on this in dry layers, that's perfectly acceptable. This took me just a couple of minutes to get this really nicely roughly blocked in, and you can already see how the light and the fabric is starting to come to life with just those 3 or 4 colors we're working with. So far 3, we had the mid-tone, we've added a slightly lighter yellow with a bit of white added in, we added the darker color. Now I'm going to add more Payne's Gray into that shadow color and bump up a few little areas, and also make sure I'm not losing any of those highlights and that angular feeling of the folds. So here I've got a little extra white added into my yellow, both to help it cover and to help add brightness to those areas. Here's that Payne's Gray shadow being carefully chosen where we're laying that darker area in. I painted the dark blue around the outside just so you could kind of see the silhouette of the piece. So now that that's dried, we're going to hop over and look at doing the layers, the kind of the pattern on the pink section. So I've gone ahead and laid tape exactly over the lines that we preserved so that we're just now painting inside the tape for the salmon section. I went ahead and put a base coat of the salmon down. I'd probably recommend doing 2 coats of the salmon since it's not going to cover as well. I'm starting by adding the kind of like cream faint dots. I would use a little bit more gel medium maybe than I did here. They're a little more present than I wish they were. I also know they'll dry down though. You can sketch your pattern. I would recommend it. Just know that if you're using gel medium to make things thin, which I do throughout this particular line of wallpaper, it won't cover your pencil lines. Make them as faint as you can, so roll a kneaded eraser or something over them. I'm mixing a very thin level of the kind of sky blue turquoisey color with a little bit of white added in. I've added quite a bit of gel medium. You could also add quite a bit of water. Just remember it's going to get grainy. It's not going to sit as flat. And I'm just roughly using that to sketch in the pattern that you can just barely see. You can see it in real life better, but in the camera it's hard to see that there's kind of a turquoise grid. Mixing that pea green and filling in my squares in the middle. You can wait on each of these layers to dry if you're very careful, but it isn't like watercolor where if you put paint right, unless you're working very wet, if you put paint right next to it, they're going to bleed together. You can kind of push the paint in and around and right next to each other and they won't blend unless you blend them with your paintbrush. But it can still feel much more controlled and it can help you stay neat sometimes if you wait on these layers to dry in between. But since, like I said, I'm working very, very thin, the layers are very, we don't have a lot of paint on this itty bitty paintbrush we're using. They are kind of drying almost as soon as I'm putting them down. Now you can see that tape is not always foolproof. Always good to remember, and keep your colors mixed so that you can clean up those edges. In this case, I did not keep that color mixed and had to mix a little bit more. There we go. So we're going to go over something called, I think this is where I do it, a little bit of dry brushing. So that means I've dried my brush off. I have as little water on it as possible. I'm using a round tip, and I'm using this to kind of push the paint, and you can kind of buff it in to create a bit of a vignette that I see on that bottom wall behind the couple and along the corners of the composition. Since it's not an opaque layer, we're not applying it thickly, it kind of comes across as almost like a transparency layer. And dry brushing can feel very controlled. You're just using as little paint on your paintbrush as possible and usually working in sort of a circular motion to buff it almost into the painting itself. Here I want these to feel a little bit more present, so what I'm doing is laying down a fairly thick layer with white paint mixed with some of the yellows and the color that I previously mixed to it, and then immediately picking it up with my rag, so I'm leaving like a 50-50% of the paint behind. And then once those are white, I can glaze on top of them with the color, and by glaze I mean a thin layer with a little bit of translucency in it, so water or medium, applied on top of the white to help pop those forward. So without that white base, it would be hard to get them to show up, but because we put that little bit of white base behind them, it helps to bring them to life. Just want to do a few of the other little kind of odd detail areas that are in this. So this is the table leg stand that I'm looking at right now. I'm painting the midtones while it's still wet. You can go ahead and just really quickly vertically lay in those highlights, and you can see how quickly it starts to really replicate the shine and the dimensionality of the original. This is another section that could be great for painting it, since it's like in front of the booth, it's in front of the person's leg. You could paint all those things first, then put tape on either side of this and put it in and feel a little bit more confident in your straight lines. Keeping perfectly straight edges is one of the things in acrylic that can be kind of hard, since the like body of the paint actually kind of fusses with your paintbrush itself. As things are drying, I'm kind of hopping around, my apologies, but hopping up and just sort of like adding in those brighter centers in the yellow ovals just to help bring them forward and to brighten their contrast against the main wall. On this chair, I'm using a technique called underpainting, which we will get into more in our second project, but I'm showing you a little bit of it here. So when I look at the original painting, I can actually see blue showing in between the kind of pinkish mauve color. One way to do that nice and easy is to paint the blue first and use it as kind of a shadow color that shows through the top layer. So I'm also using that blue to shadow the sides of the chair. Let it dry entirely, and then we're going to go through and mix that pink purple color. Oh, well, we'll let it dry entirely. We will hop over here and do a little demo. Hey, do a little demo of creating that pattern that is in the dress. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit and let that dry, but you want an entirely dry base layer first. So now that this blue is dry, I'm able to start adding the mauve over it. I'm letting my brush strokes show through, which is what we were fighting in the wallpaper. We're now using it to our advantage. I've got a little bit of water mixed with the paint to help me with this actually. And you can see that like the small areas that the blue shows through the mauve paint actually creates a lot of texture and nice like dimensionality to the piece. So you can just begin to see how that kind of layering effect done, especially when it's dry, so the colors aren't actively mixing. I mean, we're not getting blue into our color mix, we're actually just seeing like little pops of it come through, can create a really nice like depth and like realistic feeling to the fabric. The water, remember that when we add water to things or gel medium, it does change the color a little bit. So I'm counting on this drying the way I intend for it to, that I've tested. But you can see as I add water or things like that, it kind of gets kind of a milky appearance, which can be a little deceiving when you're working. So I'm mixing the green color, and you can see I'm going to do it real messy because, I don't know, something went wrong. But you can see that with a little bit of glazing medium in it, the green color is now transparent. As it mixes on top of that dried blue layer, we kind of get a beautiful sense of lighting very, very quickly, very, very easily, because the front side where I didn't put any blue is nice and bright, and the side that's layered over the blue already has a shadow color built in without me having to really mix two different versions of the green. Yuki is full of noises right now. Another spot that tape might be useful, or when I paint around this to clean up the edges. I feel like edges are where I spend a lot of my time in acrylics, trying to get them neat again, or just admitting that my style may not lean that way. So we're gonna move over and go back to working on the pattern of this. So for this piece, we had that base layer. I went ahead and took kind of the same teal royal blue and real quickly laid in shadow lines and then let those entirely dry. So now I'm going ahead and working at creating the different greens. I see 3 different greens. There's one with more yellow in it. There's one with a little bit of like a tealy green. It's brighter, it's almost Kelly, but there's more blue in it. And then there's a darker one that is also smaller strokes that's more square. So I'm trying to keep my hand random and creating kind of the layering of these 3 different greens. And then I'm going through and making sure that I create square versions of the strokes instead of letting them be tapered like that, because that's how they are in the original and it helps it feel more purposeful in many ways. Another way to do this would have been to use a very small square brush, especially sideways would have worked well, but I didn't happen to have one with me. I'm letting those layer over the areas of the shadow, but since they aren't coming through, I'm going to go ahead and add white where I can see the little strokes overlapping the shadow areas. It looks insane right now. We're just using that to help bump them forward. We're going to paint over that white section here as soon as it dries with the same greens we used over the base color. And it will just help them seem to sit on top of the paint and not disappear into it. Trying to mix the color for the little squares there. I think we've got it. Visually looking at it right now, I know the areas of white can be a little off-putting, but we'll fix it once we get the little squares in. So by underpainting those shadows and then painting the white and then painting these on top of them, you can see that now I've added the green, it's layered on top, they all work together. So I do think that if you can kind of visually think of it as like shadow and then applying the pattern over the whole thing for this, it'll work for you really well. And that is the demo for today. Hope it helps.